Our thanks to all our speakers for joining us today, and to our veteran reporters Pilar Marrero and Sunita Sarabji, who coordinate our weekly Zoom briefings. Also, thanks to Blue Shield of California Foundation for helping us initiate these briefings. Our interpreters today are Oscar Arteta, Kenneth Fong, and Jackie No, who will provide simultaneous interpreting.
So, my name is Hickey. I have helped to, actually, before we start, I just want to thank Ethnic Media Services for having me here today, and in particular to Sandy for the continued partnership that we have that's helped to develop this unique program that you'll hear a bit more about later, where we've been working with ethnic media reporters to try and expand our understanding of mis and disinformation, specifically to look at ethnic media and social media content where mis and disinformation is impacting communities that are often overlooked, not by you all, but by the mainstream media that does a lot of reporting on mis and disinformation. So just thank you so much both for having me and for that continued partnership. Just a very brief bit of background on me. I've been investigating and developing tools to try and understand mis and disinformation back since the 2016 election. Spent a long time as a journalist at the PBS NewsHour and other PBS outlets, and have been working specifically on the area of trying to monitor and collect and analyze mis and disinformation. Previously at the Kennedy School at Harvard, at a project called the Information Disorder Lab, where we monitored mis and disinformation during the 2018 midterm elections in collaboration with some of the folks at First Draft, who you're going to hear from Jacquelyn a little bit later, who's at First Draft. So we share a lot of the same interests and underlying DNA. And now in 2020, we have been aggressively working to monitor mis and disinformation, starting at the beginning of the year with a focus on the census, and now rounding out the end of the year with a focus on the election, and all throughout with a focus on the pandemic. We have learned a lot about the unique nature of this problem, and frankly, it's not something I'm going to be able to cover in just a couple of minutes, but I want to give you sort of a taste of the current things that I think are the most important to think about. So I want to walk through those somewhat quickly, although I'll try to keep my pace slow for the simultaneous translation. So first and foremost, you're all on this call because you already know this. Viral misinformation is contagious and it is dangerous. Just like an actual virus, this content spreads because people are sharing it with each other, and it creates significant problems that put our health and well-being at risk, as well as the future of our democracy. The title of this program has the word disinformation in it, but I think it's important to recognize that there are many different terms that we can use to talk about what I refer to broadly as problematic content. So misinformation, which would be information that's wrong but shared perhaps unintentionally. Disinformation, which would be problematic content that's shared intentionally. Rumors, junk news, conspiracies, even hate speech. It doesn't matter exactly what form it's in, but if it misleads, it's a problem, right? And all of these different things mislead. So it's important to recognize that there's not one hard line between stuff that, oh, that's absolutely false and I can fact check it, and this is not, or it's a little ambiguous, so I'm not going to address it. It's a much murkier, grayer area, but anything that we think is problematic is fair game for analysis, collection, and reporting, and so is something that needs to be highlighted and potentially attempted to be remedied. So I want to talk a little bit about what we are specifically referring to when we talk about problematic content. These are a couple of different areas. You'll note false and fabricated information isn't listed here because that's sort of the baseline. That's obvious, right? But beyond that, we're talking about content that uses fear and manipulation, right? Content that tries to make you feel scared, angry, or self-righteous to get you to change your behavior. That's potentially risky content that might have a problem and might have underlying misinformation embedded in it in some way or another. We're certainly interested in conspiracy theories, even when you're postulating about something, not saying it's definitively the case, but hypothesizing. That may in fact still be problematic. We'll talk a little bit more about QAnon, which presumably everyone's familiar with. But these are anything that deals with boogeymen, like the deep state or Bill Gates or George Soros, wide-ranging conspiracy theories that have existed, for the last 50 years are still present today. Then anything that's missing context. So when you see a statement on social media or a meme or an image or a video that's lacking some important piece of information that you may have, and therefore you understand it correctly, if someone else doesn't have that piece of context, they may misunderstand it, and it may in fact be damaging, right? So even if the context is wrong or completely absent, it can be a problem. Then pseudoscience, and this relates less to the election and more to some of the other issues that we face, but lots of pseudoscience has been floating around, especially during the pandemic, but has existed for a long time. Climate change denial is a perfect example of that. And anything that employs hate outright or dog whistles. The kinds of terms or themes that divide based on identity are sort of rooted in a kind of misinformation and breed and perpetuate other kinds of problematic content. So anytime we see something that may be leading towards that, we also recognize it as a problem. Then faulty logic. This is a little bit trickier to identify and requires a little bit of analysis. It can overlap with problems with context, but logical fallacies like false equivalence, where you're trying to say, well, if this is like this and that's like that, making a comparison between two things that aren't really comparable is a form of misinformation. Similarly, creating a straw man argument, saying, oh, this is a huge problem. Look at the way they're trying to explain that, even though that may not be what they were trying to explain, and then trying to tear it down. Employing a straw man fallacy argument is another kind of misinformation. It's one we see frequently employed, especially in memes and videos on social media. And finally, old content. Content that may be legitimate or accurate when it was originally published, but isn't anymore or isn't relevant anymore. When it gets shared again today, that can lead to mis and disinformation. A classic example of this is during the child separation crisis at the border during the early days of the Trump administration, an image was shared far and wide that showed a bunch of children behind bars. The kids in cages image. Now, that image was real and legitimate, but it was not taken at that moment in time. It was taken during the Obama administration. Anything like that, where there is legitimate content, but that's old, can be incredibly problematic and is tricky to identify because when it gets shared today, it seems like it might be relevant today. The big overarching idea that I want to make sure everyone recognizes is this point at the bottom. It doesn't have to be false to be a problem. Right? False is the easy stuff. All the rest of this stuff is a lot harder. It requires more vigilance, but can be just as, if not more, problematic. So with respect to the election, I want to talk about some key themes that we've been seeing, and then I'll give you a couple of examples of them. First and foremost, and I think this is probably the most significant and wide-reaching body of problematic content is the conspiracy theory we refer to as QAnon. I described it here as a wide-ranging conspiracy theory about the deep state, pedophilia, etc. I imagine that most of you at this point are familiar with the QAnon conspiracy theory. But so I don't want to go into incredible detail about it specifically, but it is a catch-all that started in a very narrow domain and has slowly expanded to catch a lot of things. A lot of new people are starting to become familiar and engaged with this broad set of conspiracy theories. And some people refer to it as a cult. I saw that BuzzFeed recently said they refer to it as a mass delusion. I recently had an extended conversation with a longtime friend of mine who is a academic who studies religion and said, actually, it has more characteristics that correspond to a religion than a cult. So I frequently refer to people who believe in QAnon as QAnon adherents. So I think that there's a lot to be said about it and it is problematic, but I'll talk about all the rest first. The most concerning theme that I see cropping up around the election is about an impending civil war. This is a growing theme that is appearing on both sides of the political spectrum and is at this point starting to grow into almost a fait accompli. Like it is going to happen. Whatever the outcome of the upcoming election, there is likely to be violence. And I'm not arguing that there is likely to be, but that the messages on social media are arguing that there is likely to be. And that is sort of seeding the ground for actual potential violence. But at the moment, there is no reason to believe that there will be violence. And so all of the conversation and messaging around it is problematic because it's amplifying the potential risk for violence that we clearly do not need. Then I want to talk about this one because I think it is an interesting one and one that we've seen a lot of recently. And it's always been in political discourse, but it's accelerating now. And that's ideological hyper, right? Like this is consuming our discourse, and we're no longer having conversations about the issues or the identities of the politicians who are running for office. We're instead exaggerating narrow bands of their perspective and amplifying them in ways that are distorting the reality. Those are sort of the like crazy and extreme things. And then on the other side of this slide are the conventional things that are incredibly problematic. We're having a lot of trouble getting a handle on them, and are only likely to accelerate. The first is about voting access. This is one that is persistent. This is not the first election where we're seeing this, but messages about voting itself. So when can you or can't you register for a mail-in ballot or absentee ballot, when, where, and how you can vote. Both intentional and unintentional versions of this. The classic example is saying Republicans can vote on Wednesdays, or vice versa. Republicans vote on Tuesdays, Democrats vote on Wednesdays. Obviously, everyone votes on election day or before, so it's hard to narrow down exactly what the right or wrong way is to talk about that. But there is a lot of mis and disinformation around voting access. There is even more mis and disinformation around ballot risks. I think the classic thing that we've seen, and I'll show some examples of it, are ballots being thrown out. Now that we have this massive volume of vote by mail and absentee voting, and a lot of rhetoric about fraud related to absentee voting and vote by mail, we're seeing a lot of mis and disinformation around it. Almost every day, there is a new image circulating on social media of a pile of ballots somewhere, right? And lots of questions being raised about it. There are also more complex questions about voter fraud and concepts like ballot harvesting. Ballot harvesting is essentially a code word or almost a dog whistle for sometimes potentially legitimate activity or the false implication of fraud. But ballot harvesting has now become a part of the lexicon, and whenever you see it, you can almost always recognize that there's some risk in problematic content that references it. And then finally, this big, broad, unfounded fear-mongering. So allegations about stealing or rigging the election, right? It's connected to a bunch of those other themes, but in and of itself is its own theme. And so we see quite a lot of that. And that message is sort of part of the drip, drip, drip of problematic content that people are experiencing on a daily basis that is undermining their faith in democracy, undermining their faith in our institutions, and sort of laying the groundwork for chaos come November 4th. So for each of these themes, I want to really briefly talk about some examples. So QAnon, you're all familiar with. There's, honestly, I don't even really want to talk about it, Pilar. I'm just so upset and overwhelmed, and I can see my time is running out. But
yes, it is.
QAnon is, it is this mass conspiracy that it is almost impossible to convince people who believe in it to stop believing in it. And you should be on the lookout for any references to anything that has to do with the deep state, JFK Jr., George Soros, and Bill Gates. There's rarely truth in those, and there is frequently conspiratorial misinformation. The Civil War, you can see here examples coming from fringe media outlets like